Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Yesterday about online gaming, and the question of The Sims came up. There were a couple of people there who'd worked on Sims Online. And the conversation just sort of stopped, and we said, what happened? And the question was essentially, how did that go so badly awry with such smart people? And the first answer was, there are a lot of answers to that question, but the one that really caught my eye was, the move from The Sims to The Sims Online made a mistake in assuming that the player would also be the avatar. So you completely lost the dollhouse pleasure of The Sims in moving online. And it made me want to ask, and I am going to ask now, what's the worst thing you've ever seen happen in this domain? What's the biggest gap between intention and effect, or theory and practice? And what lessons do you take from that? Ross actually had a great observation about Wikitorial, so I'll call on Ross first.
So you may know the LA Times Wikitorial debacle, where Michael Kinsley got brought in as the new editor of the LA Times and had this idea like, hey, let's take an editorial and let's put it in a wiki and we'll have something like Wikipedia or something like that. And it basically broke all conventions. He took tool features out of the tool and he broke all practices. So he took things out like recent changes so people could actually monitor what was changing and what damage was being done. He didn't set a goal for the collaboration. He didn't cultivate any community a little bit beforehand. Instead, what they did was basically take an editorial about the war, slapped it in a page, gave no other instruction except this is the future. And suddenly you had an edit war, obviously. Jimmy Wales, and a couple of people saw this was going to explode. So Jimmy Wales from Wikipedia stepped in and said, hey, we have a wiki of infinite space. We moderate sometimes by saying, hey, let's have a pro page and a con page. And that started to work, and there's starting to be a little bit of community kind of despite him. But then it got slash-dotted, and there were goatsy images. The intern got woken up at 4 o'clock in the morning and was told to shut the damn thing down. So it was bad in both tool and practice.
Right. Linda, you, I think, were...
Oh, yeah. Dana, this happened probably before you were born. It was when Microsoft was first starting to experiment with instant messaging, and Lily and I were doing the virtual world social media thing over in research. And I went over to the people in MSN, and they were showing me their prototypes they were very proud of, which basically showed full screen instant messaging. And I looked at them and I said, won't fly. But it was when I first started thinking about continuous partial attention, because here was Microsoft, a productivity software company, used to owning all screen real estate and used to, for Word, Excel, etc. And I went over and I said, people are communicating. They don't want to sit on a full screen and wait to see what's going to happen. They want to be doing other things at the same time. So I don't know if that software ever got released or not, but the very early days of designing instant messaging at Microsoft were full screen.
Other examples of things going horribly awry, or Howard?
Well, I think ultimately the Omidyar network would regard this as a success in the sense that quite often communities learn by falling into rat holes together. But if you're not familiar with Omidyar network, the Omidyars decided not to start a family foundation with the approximately 15 billion that they would like to eventually give away, but to use what they felt was successful about eBay, creating a platform whereby people could empower themselves and empower each other. So they started an online network, a virtual community, which I think has about 12,000 people in it now. It's about a year old. Very successful, of course, do-gooders, largely, nonprofit groups. And the promise of that money, I'm sure, has a lot to do with the attraction. They had a reputation system that they've been working the bugs out, but which is interesting in that you get points for starting discussions, and and doing other things, and people can give you points. They can give or take points away from people, posts, or threads. And when it reaches a certain negative level, the person, the post or the thread becomes invisible. It's only on the homepage of the user. After, I guess, about 8 months of this, the Omidyar said, well, here's an experiment. Here's $25,000 for the community to spend however it wishes. I got involved in that point because there seemed to me to be an obvious error here of not having a decision-making boot sector. There was no specified method for making decisions, including who would you enfranchise. There's no real checking on identity. You can create accounts very easily. They had I think about 20,000 posts. Quite often there was a recurrent pattern, which is as soon as people started converging, the disagreeing groups began to compromise. Someone would say, this compromise is not democratic. There are 8,000 people here, and they're not all participating, even though people sent messages to their social networks. This was on the front page at all times. Again, the pattern in my experience, and it did no good for me to keep pointing out these patterns, really, was that only a small percentage of any online community wants to spend time thrashing about governance. The rest of the people want to spend their time, even when there's $25,000 to spend. So of those 8,000 people, probably 400 at most paid attention to that topic at all, and maybe 100 of them posted ever, and maybe 30 were responsible for those 20,000 posts. And people left. Someone was discovered to have created 100 or 200 sock puppets who were giving and taking away points from people. Certainly, experiments like that surface the flaws in the system, and they are taking that into account and revising it. And I think it's a learning experience. And they ultimately did decide on how to spend the $25,000 by splitting into 3 groups who weren't able to reconcile and splitting the money into 3 parts. And maybe someday this will scale up to the point where philanthropy is no longer a kind of walled garden foundation, but a network. And I would like to see it succeed, but it was a very interesting experiment in trying to do something on principles that worked. Obviously, a reputation system works really well for, am I going to send a check to somebody on eBay, but doesn't work so well in this
for am I going to get a check from somebody?
So another lesson, if people want to look up something called Cobot. How many of you are familiar with Cobot? This would be mostly the social media group and other folks who we all had to read it. Cobot was this really great little bot that Xerox put in, which was tracking all sorts of behavior, what kinds of communication were occurring in a discussion, in a chat. And people got sort of frustrated with this bot and were like, well, this bot's not giving anything back to the community. You should make it give something back to the community. So the designers went, oh, well, this is great. Well, you can ask the bot questions, right? So I can say, who do I talk to the most? It's this great thing. I can get this reflection, right? But then I realized I can go, who does Linda talk to the most? Wait a minute, I talk to Linda the most, and Linda doesn't talk to me the most. And also you spiral out of control because having this quantitative data of what it means to sort of interact gets reinterpreted within that kind of environment. And all of a sudden, I hate Linda because she's not talking to me the most. She likes Elizabeth much more. All right. She likes Elizabeth so much more. And so there's this interesting dynamic of when and where does providing data actually have ramifications for sociability.
So what did they do to the Cobot?
It destroyed the community. And therefore, it all died.
Randy.
I want to bring up an old one, and only because it came up in Slashdot today. So it's still not gone away. And that is the tyranny of metaphor. And Chip and I, when we built the original Habitat in 1986, were actually the first victim of this. And we were actually talked out of it by a young VP named Steve Case. The conceit was that the first Avatar world would be based strongly on metaphors in the real world. And this is before cell phones and before I am, so it's a little hard to cast your mind into the set, but try to do it. We said people would want to be able to contact each other if they weren't in the same space. So we said, well, we have that. It's a telephone system. We put a telephone in your avatar's house, and there would be telephone booths around where you could call. And we said, this is great. We set off to implement it. We implemented the core system. Then we started to implement telephones, and we got a call from Steve Case and several people, and they're saying, no, that's not going to work. I said, but we've got avatars, their bodies, their houses, their streets, their all these things. We need to, we're really sticking to this metaphor here. He said, no, people contact each other directly with personal messages. That's what they were calling them. And we fought back a little bit, and after a while we gave up. They said they know their business more than we do, and we implemented ESP. Now this was, we came up with a new metaphor for instant messaging. Now, of course, if it wasn't a cell phone, this would not have had been a fight, because our metaphor of cell phone would have worked just great. But we're still seeing this today. I just got back from the Metaverse Roadmap before I came to this conference, and people are once again talking about the great metaphors of walking your avatar into a shopping mall. Yeah. And these kind of things. So I want to get this on the really, really bad ideas list.
Right.
In another place. Thank you.
Right.
Well, Star Wars, there's so many virtual worlds we can talk about this aspect, but Star Wars Galaxy seems to me has all the greatest hits.
Richly
of
over-provisioned, as we say.
That can possibly go wrong. But the top thing I think that's kind of relevant, particularly for thinking about social computing, is starting off to model of a social space or a virtual world in this context that's trying to capture a well-known fiction or a license that people already have a knowledge of, and then in a sense breaking the mimesis between the world you create and the thing that people already think they know about that world leads to a whole bunch of people who kind of stumble around in an alienated state looking for the thing that they expected to find based on this experience of a kind of predicate fiction and never finding it.
Like you can't be a Jedi.
From that. Yeah.
Yeah, you can't be a Jedi until you become like a hairdresser. It was like, that's the point where I quit the game, was when I realized all the trivial revisions I had to be before I could unlock my Jedi character.
Right. Oh, the joke was that it ultimately was more of an Uncle Owen simulator than a Luke Skywalker.
Any other fun lessons?
Well, this is sort of this is before all of us were born, but I was thinking, especially when someone earlier asked the question about different ways of recording memories. It's a little too early to know what the unintended consequences are of living in a society in which everything about you is recorded all the time, and we start to, not only are we archiving everything from your ultrasound picture to everything you've said, photographs of everything you've done, all your chats, but it's an external recorded memory. And I think one of the things to think about as an unintended consequence is when written language was invented, it destroyed a different way of using memory, and the whole oral tradition of passing on narratives as these sort of ritualized ways of speaking, of saying things, of repeating it over and over, a whole rhythm of speaking, and a very way of thinking was destroyed by the process of being able to write it down. And I think we're in as extensive a revolution by creating this enormous archive of continually recorded objects about our every interaction. So I think there will certainly be enormous consequences we don't understand from that. I got your picture doing that.
I
recorded you.
We're trying to get into the
So the horrible mistake was the invention of the written language. Is that what that
I wonder sometimes how much this notion that not everything about you is known is actually modern or Oxford. If you think about small towns, historically, everybody knew everything about you from the day you're born to the day you die. It's only in this larger, massive, communities that we have this luxury of this kind of anonymity or privacy. But now we're losing it again. So I actually think that people are historically accustomed to that level of awareness and knowledge from other people, but we're going back to that original.
Well, we're also rechanging the notions of privacy and publicness. And I think that's where I think Judith's point is so critical, is that what we're seeing is we're going back in some ways to certain kinds of awareness of each other, but we're also going forward into the possibilities and the overwhelming kinds of awareness that, there's a cognitive limit to the number of people that you can pay attention to, and that you can kind of keep all of the gossip rules on. I mean, this is the Dunbar 150 that gets thrown around, right? There's a cognitive load. So what does it mean now that we have access to be able to pay attention to so many more people with the level of in-depthness that we could pay attention to the 15 who happen to live in our neighborhood? And so how do we actually resolve this, and how does this change? Question mark, question mark.
The difference is that in the neighborhood, it wasn't out of choice. You were born into it. Whereas here, you can select, and you have the option of selecting, and that's pretty powerful.
I think we have to turn it over.
Turn it over to Elizabeth. So thank you all.